Let me start by showing you the chest of a frightened 65-year-old man. He's frightened because he's no fool and he's smoked all his life and he's got a chronic cough which he can't get rid of. And this is a CT scan that's been rendered so you can see his skin. The top right and left corners are the folds of his armpits, and the top in the middle are the dewlap, the saggy bits of skin under his neck. And we're going to do a virtual dissection, and we're going to dissolve his skin to reveal the 50 or 60 layers of muscles that lie around the rib cage, the costal cartilage that started to calcify on the outside, the 40 or so ribs that encase all your soft and precious organs. And then inside those we've got layers of pleura that invest the lungs and the heart, and then deeper again we've got the airways, the trachea, the bronchi, which lead out to some 30,000 small bronchioles. And in there is his lung cancer, sitting in the apex of his left lung. So radiologists look at X-rays the way we look at patients, as if they're standing in front of us. So his left lung is on the right, and there's his lung cancer, measuring 1 centimetre in diameter, with no sign that it's spread anywhere else. This is entirely curable. So let's dress him up in all his soft tissues and bones and skin, take him round to the X-ray room and ask a radiographer to do a chest X-ray. And there it is. And it appears on my colleague's work list, Dr. Fargal, who was one of my trainees. He's now been a consultant with us for 2 or 3 years. It's the end of an afternoon of reporting GP films, and he's bored and he's tired and he wants to go home. And in there is a potentially curable cancer. And my question to you is, how long do you expect him to look at that X-ray before he makes a decision that it's normal or abnormal? 5 minutes? No, you can't have 5 minutes. 5 minutes and he'll be out the door. We cannot have radiologists reporting 10 films an hour. How about 2 minutes? 2 minutes, even that's a bit slow. So a consultant radiologist should be turning around 30 films an hour. So you've got 30 seconds for looking at the film, you've got to dictate a report into voice recognition, and then you have to correct all the mistakes that voice recognition makes, and then you have to authorize it and bring up the next case. So 20 seconds. What about 10 seconds? Would you be happy if that was your chest X-ray with a life-threatening cancer that's potentially curable, for him to look at it for 10 seconds? What about 2? I can't be serious, can I? What about 0.2 seconds? 200 milliseconds. I can tell you that Dr. Fargal, probably 70% chance he saw that within the first 200 milliseconds of that mass, that image which comprises several billion binary bytes, several thousand shades of grey. He saw that little blush that sits right in the top right-hand corner. You can see it just there. Within 200 milliseconds. By 3 seconds, the game was over. He was writing his report and the patient was being called in for their CT. Now, this phenomenon of an expert radiologist being able to spot something that is very subtle in the blink of an eye is something that I came across as a trainee nearly 20 years ago, when I would stare at a film for 10 minutes and some grizzled old consultant would walk past the back of the room and go, oh, there's a lung cancer, oh, there's a polyp in the colon. And 1, I was very impressed, and 2, I was very irritated. 3 or 4 years later, I would put up an X-ray and immediately know it was abnormal, but couldn't see the abnormality. I would look and look and look, and 2 or 3 seconds later, I could find the abnormality. That's what was bothering me, even though I couldn't see it. And I thought I must be going mad. But in the last 10 or 15 years, there is a growing body of evidence, of research, mainly from psychologists, that explains why we get these phenomena. And it's a very well recognized phenomena in a radiologist, where a film or a case goes up that they immediately know is wrong. And so that's the subject of my talk today. I'm going to talk about what it is that makes an expert radiologist just so brilliant, and what it is that makes us miss dancing gorillas so that BBC journalists make fun of us. I do like this clip from the internet. The bottom line, if you can just about read it, says, but in one study, more than 3/4 of specialist tumour spotters were caught out by the greatest anomaly of their career. I mean, you can barely see it. It's there. It's a little gorilla sitting there. If they think that's the greatest anomaly of my career, I would be very happy with that. So we're going to talk about that, why we miss things, and why we are no different from any other member of the human race and every other expert in their field, be they an accountant, a teacher, a glaciologist. We all develop these same human skills that make us intuitive experts in certain areas. So let me show you how it works. I'm going to show you some pictures now, which are going to appear on your screen. The first one is going to appear for about 50 milliseconds. There's going to be a countdown, 3, 2, 1, black screen, and then it's going to appear. So stare at it, and I'm going to ask you some questions. "50 milliseconds, 1/20th of a second. If I asked you, was that animal, mineral, or vegetable? Most of you would say it was animal. If I asked you whether it was a bird or a fish or a mammal, most would say mammal. If I said it was a cat or dog, you'd go cat. Well, a lot of you would within that first 50 milliseconds. So you're able to categorize a complex image of some 200,000 pixels in the blink of an eye without even thinking about it. So why can't a radiologist do exactly the same thing if they know what they're looking for? Now, if I ask you the question, was that a black cat or a tabby? Ooh, that starts to get hard. So I'll give you another chance. 200 milliseconds. Probably saw some stripes. You'd go for tabby. So you give a radiologist 200 milliseconds and they can tell it's abnormal and they can start to put a diagnosis to it. Now you can do that because you are an expert in spotting cats. You've looked at them all your life, you've seen them all around you, therefore you have that innate skill. We're going to try another one, different species. Okay, now that may be a little bit more difficult. Some of you should be able to say whether that's a male or a female. You should have some idea of which part of the world they come from. If I ask you the question, was that Simon Cowell? I can tell by the giggles that most of you think it isn't. Now, I've chosen those two figures because, interestingly, in a Mori poll from 2012, Adolf Hitler was found to be the most recognizable face in the UK. So despite him being from 70 years ago in history, he's 95% of the UK population can recognize him. Interestingly, 1 in 20 school children think that he's the German national football coach. And Simon Cowell was a close second. And they're quite useful for this study because you've got two white middle-aged males with dark hair, semi-profile, with one major feature difference, which is the moustache. So your intuition, that immediate grasp of an image, allows you certainly to categorize an image into some rough area, and if it's a particularly iconic image, allows you to make a specific diagnosis in as little as 50 milliseconds. And this translates into a radiologist's memory. So you all have a memory of what Adolf Hitler's face looks like, and you could recall it, and without looking at a picture you could probably draw a cartoon of it. Radiologists develop the same sort of memory for abnormal x-rays. So it's quite common for a clinician to ring me up and say, Andoni, I've got this patient, you must remember them. They're a 53-year-old woman, they've got this condition, blah, 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 blah. And I say, no, Tanya, I can't remember her at all. And I pull up the x-ray and I say, oh, yeah, I remember her. I can remember the x-ray, but none of the clinical detail that goes with it. And that's quite a common phenomenon. So what's been working here is a psychological process which has been labeled by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel laureate psychologist who wrote this wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he describes this process as System 1. And this is your unconscious, free-flowing, easy, don't have to think about it, thought process. It's automatic, it's easy. For those of you who drive cars, you will have had this experience where you've been for a 2-hour drive, arrived at your destination, turned off the engine, and sat there and thought, I don't remember making a single conscious decision about which way to go and what to do at junctions and what to do at lights. And that's your system one. It's quite scary, but it's very good at making decisions where it feels comfortable. If you're a learner driver, you cannot do that because you don't have the expertise to recognize the road situations. So you can train this system one, this intuitive response to a visual stimulus. And this is a figure from a piece of research that I was involved in with Lindsay Cooper and Alistair Gale from Loughborough, where they brought down some eye tracking equipment to our Radiology Academy. Now, an eye tracker is just a box that sits underneath a computer monitor, but it reflects a light out of your pupils, and as you move the pupils, it can track where they go on the screen. And then it produces you a graphic that shows you a blue spot, and the blue spot grows for the longer you keep your gaze fixed, and then the order that the blue spots are linked tells you the order that you start looking across the screen. So your control group over here, these were a group of postdoctoral students at Loughborough. They weren't medics, they weren't medically trained, but they're bright people, and they had no idea of anatomy. What you can see is that they look at the most obvious anatomical structure they can see, which is this white structure in the middle of the brain, and these are the ventricles filled with fluid, and they just sort of wander up and down because it's a pretty looking shape. In the middle is a radiology trainee, so this one's been in post for about 3 years. They have somehow learnt some anatomy, and they've seen some disease, and they've seen a number of scans, so they're starting to know what to look for. And their eye wanders around, and what they're really looking for is a tiny white spot here in the basal ganglia, which is a focus of ischemia. So it's not a very obvious abnormality. And they wander around, their eyes sort of go around the lateral ventricles and the deep white matter, until at point 34, they rest on the abnormality over here. The consultant is a consultant neuroradiologist who's been in post for about 15 years. And he opens up the image, and his eye immediately goes to the abnormality. And that happens in less than 50 milliseconds. That cannot be a conscious decision. So without thinking about it, his brain has processed the image and found the abnormality and led his eyes to it. This is the sort of intuitive thing that we do every day when we're recognizing cats or dogs or our kids or our parents or dangerous situations when we're driving. But radiologists can train themselves to do that with medical images. Now, wherever you have a system 1, there's going to be a system 2. So let me introduce it by showing you some more flashing images. But this time we're going to do some maths. So here we go, 200 milliseconds. I give you loads of time to solve these problems. Easy. 5. All right. Feeling confident? We'll do another one. 200 milliseconds. Ooh, bit more difficult. Product of 47 and 37. You don't know that. You know 2 plus 3 because that's deeply programmed from when you're a small child at school doing your numbers repeatedly. It's an easy number to remember, an easy combination, but no one learns intuitively 47 by 37. That is a system 2 problem. It's something that you have to get a paper out and a pencil and you have to work your way through it. It takes effort. This is a conscious, logical reasoning process. The analogy is if driving long distances without thinking about it is system 1, this is going into an exam where you concentrate for 3 hours, you know that every point matters and everything you write counts. And it's why you come out of an exam feeling completely exhausted, because this is all system 2. Your brain does not like system 2. It's naturally lazy. So whenever it can, it uses system 1, but when it has to and it's forced to, it'll use system 2 to solve more complex problems. Now, there's a constant interplay between system 1 and system 2. And this is a very old optical illusion which you will all have seen. It's called the Muller-Lyer optical illusion. And you all know what it's about. You all know that the horizontal lines are exactly the same length. And even though you know that, when you look at it, your system 1 is nagging away at you, and it's going, no, they're not. The top one's bigger, the top one's bigger. And however much you tell yourself they're the same length, you cannot get rid of that little nag that says the top one's bigger. And that's system 1. It's all pervasive, it never stops, it never shuts up. It's only system 2 that ever gives up and goes, oh, all right. And it's that interplay that's so important when it comes to making mistakes and missing things on radiological images. So when it's obvious, that's fine. And even when it's normal, we're very good at describing when things are normal. Where we make these mistakes are when difficult decisions have to be made. And there are 2 types of difficult decisions. On the right is the easy one. There's a tibia and a fibula, and you can see there's an abnormality in the distal tibia, and there's a lump growing out of it, and an ill-defined hole in the middle of it. So no one's going to miss that. The only problem I have is trying to decide what it is. Is it an osteoblastoma, which is a benign lesion that's painful, but it's not going to kill you? Or is it a small osteosarcoma that is almost certainly going to kill you? And that's a system 2 problem that we have to sort out. So we're not really going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about is the subtle abnormality. On the left, you have an X-ray of a 39-year-old male, and it looks reasonably normal. He's got knee pain, and you sort of want to let it go, but there is a little blush of sclerosis, or white stuff here on the medial side of tibial plateau, and your brain looks at it and goes, is it? Is it? And when it's struggling, system 2 gives up, and system 1 goes, call it normal, even when there's a stress fracture underlying it. And this is how it works. Let me show you this first of all. This is the only bit where I'm going to get you to use your system 2 in the whole of this talk, because I want you to this is quite an interesting graph which comes from Deborah Manning's paper in the BJR a few years ago, and I need to just explain it. So what we're looking at are false negative responses in reporting chest x-rays. Now what that means is they've taken a bunch of radiologists and they've given them a set of x-rays which have pulmonary nodules. So these are little growths. Some are cancers, some are not, but they're bits of tissue in the lung. And they've documented where all these things are. They then put them in front of the radiologist with eye scanning technology, and they ask them whether they can see anything or not, and then they watch their eyes and see where they go. So what we're really interested in is all of those negative responses, the ones where the radiologist says, this is normal, but they're wrong. And in all of those cases where they report a chest x-ray to be normal and there is an abnormality, their eye will have seen the abnormality at some stage. So 70% of the abnormalities will have been looked at for at least 1 second. 60% will have been looked at for over 2 seconds, and a large number, over 30%, will have been looked at for over 3 seconds, which is no big deal. But when you ask the radiologist and you go back and you say, okay, look at this x-ray, why did you report that as normal? They will say, I didn't see it. You say, but your eyes looked at it for 2 seconds. They say, nope, I don't remember it. I never saw it. So one of 2 things is happening. Either your system 1 is doing everything for you subconsciously and making the decisions that it is normal, or somehow you're making a conscious decision to call it normal, but then forgetting that decision because you've had a satisfying search strategy. There is a thing called the cognitive reflection test, which was something introduced by Shane Fredericks in the mid-2000s, which again many of you will have seen, and it illustrates this interplay between system 1 and system 2 very nicely. So if we read it together, a bat and a ball together cost £1.10, the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Your immediate response is 10p. Now, most of you will go, yeah, but that doesn't quite feel right. And what's happened is as you've read it, your system 1's going, yeah, I can do this. I can do the maths. And then it stops and says, actually, no, it's more complicated than that. And it tries to wake up system 2. But this is a dark room. and it's the end of the day and you're tired and you can't be bothered. So you go, oh no, leave it. I'll go back to 10p. I know it's not quite right, but it'll do. And that process happens all the time when we're trying to make decisions. And the more tired you get, the more we rely on system one going to the default easy solution. Right, system one. That's really what we're talking about today. It's the most magical and it's the most problematic of our psychological processes. And it itself is divided into two different parts. Some people call it the non-selective and the selective part, or the global focal parts. There are various names for these different hypotheses. And the most important part is the first part, the global part. And this is the thing that happens in the first 10, 20, 25 milliseconds. It's what gives you what the Germans call the Gestalt. So when the cat image came up, you didn't have any detail. You couldn't tell whether it was a tabby, but it was a cat. It had the form of a cat. It had that impression. The English word is a gist, which is a direct descendant of the word Gestalt. And birders, if you're a birder, you'll have heard about the jizz of a bird. And a really good birder, out of the corner of their eye, will be able to see a flutter go by and go, well, that's a thrush, just from some ill-defined shape. And the jizz is also a corruption of the word gist. So all of these things happen in a very, very short, immediate period, and they do two things. One, they allow you to categorize your bird into a thrush, but also in big scenes, it applies context. Now, the categorization has been demonstrated in radiology. So if you take mammographers, this is a breast X-ray a screening breast X-ray looking for breast cancers, which has been given to me by Erica Denton, our professor of radiology, breast radiology in Norwich. I mean, I can't see the breast cancer on here. It's just hopeless. I don't know how she spots these things. But sure enough, there is one on there. And if you show a series of mammograms to expert radiologists, and for half a second, and say normal, abnormal, more often than not, they get it right. But if you then say, okay, the abnormal one, where was the cancer? Which quadrant? They can't do that bit. All they get is the Gestalt, this feeling that it's abnormal or normal. What they don't get is any spatial localization of where the disease is. Now, the context you get in the Gestalt is very nicely illustrated by work done with chess players. So if you're an expert chess player and you flash up a board like that with chess pieces on it in a set move, and you give them 10 seconds to memorize all the positions, and then you take it away and say reproduce those positions, they can do it much, much better than someone who isn't a chess player, because they use the context of the game to help localize where the pieces should be. If you then repeat the experiment on a blank board with the chess pieces arranged randomly, they do as well or as badly as anybody else who doesn't play. It's because they've lost the context of the scenery from that initial image. Now, you can prove this in psychological studies by a very, very clever little test. And it's called, it's a test of contextual cueing. And this is how they do it in psychology. They show you an image of a scene, and I'm going to show you one. It's going to appear for 50 milliseconds. And then they ask a question of the candidate. So here comes your scene for 50 milliseconds, and it's gone. Now, most of you will have recognized that looked like some sort of living room, some sort of living space. And then they ask the volunteer, right, we want you to look, and they've got an eye tracking device on there, look for a mirror. But the software won't show you the picture again. It will show you what you're looking at as if you're in a blackened room with a torch shining it around, so that you don't get any input from the scene itself. You just see where the eye goes. So you get an appearance like this, a little spot of light that starts to look around the room, and then you can track it. And even though there isn't a mirror there was never a mirror in that image to give you a clue where to look. The scene itself decided where you were going to look. So that initial Gestalt sets the context of what you are then going to do. So with our expert view of the MRI, the moment that image appeared, it's a T2 weighted MRI through the mid part of the brain, the lateral ventricles. He has deeply embedded in there a set of diseases and abnormalities that he knows subconsciously appear at that particular level, which is why he's guided to that point. And then after that, he will scan around, again subconsciously, at 20 to 40 sequential objects per second in order, looking at things that are relevant to that particular abnormality and to the context of the scene that has been set by that one image. So that is one of the reasons why radiologists miss dancing gorillas on a CT. Because when I look at that chest CT, even though I'm not a chest radiologist, I see an image that is windowed in a particular way, so that all the bones and the fat and the muscle are almost white. And the moment I see that, I know I'm looking for lung nodules, whether I think about it or not. And I go into lung nodule mode, and I'll scan up and down looking for little nodules. So that's one reason why we'll miss these abnormalities, because the scene setting determines how our brain processes the rest of the image intuitively. Now, if you said to me, this is an exam, and whether you pass or fail depends on you finding that nodule, well, then I may go into system 2. I may concentrate really hard, and in which case you come up against another phenomenon which explains why you'll still miss the dancing gorilla. And the dancing gorilla comes from the invisiblegorilla.com. And again, they're a group of researchers in the States, and this was their very first gorilla study, which really made all the headlines. And you can look it up on YouTube and see it, but you'll know the answer now. But show it to unwitting friends. But it's a video of just 1 minute and 22 seconds, and there are 2 teams playing basketball in this hall, one in white shirts, one in black shirts, and you're told you have to count the number of times the white team passes the ball to each other. And so you sit there and you do it, and at the end of the thing they say, did you see the gorilla? In the middle of the video, the gorilla walks on from right to left, stands in the middle, waves at you, and goes off. Total period 9 seconds. 70% of people doing the task will not see the gorilla. And when you ask them, did you see the gorilla? They say no. And you then say there was a gorilla. They get quite angry. They just don't believe you until you show them the video again. And even then, they think you've shown them a different video. So it's very powerful. And this is selective blindness or attention blindness. When system 2 is incredibly focused, everything else around that tunnel vision becomes obliterated. So 2 reasons for why we're going to miss things. So that's all about our performance, system 1, system 2, and how they interact. But they're not fixed, and I've alluded to that already. As we get tired, our performance drops. And this is a fantastic paper from 2011 looking at the performance, well, not the performance, but decision-making from a parole board in Israel. So once a year, or maybe every 6 months, this parole board sits and they consider parole applications from prisoners. And what they did was they mapped your chance of success of getting parole against the time of the day. So at first thing in the morning, your chance of getting parole is 65 to 75%. By the time you get to about 11 o'clock in the morning, you've got no chance. They controlled for whether the prisoners were Palestinian or Jewish. It made no difference. They looked at the original length of the sentence. It made no difference. The only thing that correlated with your chance of getting parole was the time of day. They had a break, and then your chance of parole comes back up again. And this is an example of decision-making fatigue. So when you're having to repeatedly use system 2 to think, you get tired. Now, it's not that this point here, these judges are particularly malignant, and they haven't had a cup of coffee, and they haven't had anything to eat, and they think, you know what, I just don't care about you. What happens is they default to the default position, which is not to change the length of the sentence. They're not making the sentence any worse. They're just leaving it as it is. So there's one direction that these prisoners can go in. They can either stay where they are, or their sentences can be shortened. And this is decision-making fatigue, which we see all the time in radiology. And in fact, some of the PACS manufacturers. Now, PACS is the overall name for how we archive images and how we report our studies, have started to put breaks in. So if they find you've been reporting for 2 hours, they'll shut you down and say, a little message will come back and say, go away, come back in 15 minutes. Because we're increasingly recognizing that if you work for too long, you will start to make decisions that are influenced by fatigue. Now, there are all sorts of things you can do to improve the performance of System 1 and System 2. And these are some of the things I'm going to talk about. Priming, the environment you work in, discomfort, which sounds an odd thing to talk about, and finally my favourite of all, which is willpower. And we've come back to Adolf, and I'm going to show you the last of the flashing images, again at 100 milliseconds. Now, that probably seemed like a hugely long time. That must have looked so easy for you to see. And one of the reasons is that you've now seen 4 or 5 of his images repeated again and again. So visual priming is enough to, one, prepare you to look for new disease, or to trigger in your brain subconscious thoughts about a particular condition. So advertisers use it all the time. Interestingly, this image comes from Rapiscan Systems UK, which is a company that works with security cameras or security X-ray machines in airports. And of course, what they're looking for are bombs and guns and anything that's dangerous. But as you can imagine, the instance of someone carrying a handgun onto a plane is incredibly low. The chances of any single security guard spotting one on an X-ray machine is also incredibly low. So you get bored. Why would you look? Why would you even think to look for a handgun? So what this company does is they have a program that superimposes guns and bombs onto luggage as it comes through. So every guard will know that in their day they're going to see 1 or 2 critical abnormalities, and it keeps them on their toes. And it means you can also measure their performance in real time. Now, the priming can be visual or it can be verbal. And this is an example of a psychology test which illustrates how verbal priming can work. It's one of my favorites. Again, American psychologists took some undergraduates into a room and they told them, this is the purpose of the test. We want to see how quick you are at turning random groups of words into whole sentences, and we're going to time you. So they sat them at desks, and one group were given a set of words like that, and another group were given a set of words like that. And they sat there and they did their test, and they were all timed, and at the end of it they said, thank you very much, the experiment's over, we'll send you a check in the post. But of course, unbeknown to them, that's when the experiment really started. As they left the room, the experimenters then timed the time it took for them to get from the door to the exit of the building. And if you were in the group that had to make sentences out of these words here, you were significantly slower than if you had to make sentences out of these words over here. So visual and verbal cues profoundly influence the way you respond to all sorts of things around you. And of course, radiologists have verbal cues all the time in the form of a clinical question that comes with the radiology request. The environment affects how you work. So this is a lovely study from Cambridge, from the School of Biology, where they had an honesty box where people put money in to pay for the coffee and milk and so on. And what they did was every week they changed the poster behind the honesty box, and they alternated between flowers and eyes. And you can see that whenever there was an eye set behind the coffee box, the honesty box, then the payments increased. And that's all they did. Everything else was exactly the same. But the very fact there's a piece of paper with a pair of eyes behind you is enough to make you change your behavior. And any tin pot dictator knows this. You know, if you see a photograph of some officer in a small African dictatorship, they will always have a poster, the only bit of decoration they have in their office, of the dictator at the time, And that's the famous picture of Saddam Hussein, who was on a huge number of watches. If you Google Saddam Hussein watches, there are huge numbers of these available, and they're collector's items. I'm going to take you back to the cognitive reflection test. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do this. We've done it once, I'm not going to do it again, but this is another example of Shane Frederick's cognitive reflection test. And we know that to do this properly, you need to trigger system 2. One way of making it easier is to change the font. So that's quite readable. If I change the font to that is almost impossible to read. Now, you'd thought that would make your life more difficult, but actually all the experiments show the more difficult a question is to read, the easier it is to solve. Because it's difficult, it triggers system 2, it makes you concentrate. So when you're irritated at work by the little noises and the people ringing you, they're actually doing you a favour. They're stressing your system 2 and encouraging you to work more efficiently. You get cognitive strain, physical strain will do the same thing. So this is all the rage now, standing desks, but Winston Churchill was way ahead of the game in terms of standing desks and always used to work from a homemade standing desk, which he used in Downing Street. And the physical strain of standing and moving around will increase your performance to a degree. You can now buy walking treadmills, mainly from US companies, somewhere between $5,000 and $9,000. But there is an optimum speed at which you can walk. So if you walk at about 1 mile an hour, you can demonstrate that using a walking workstation can at least mean you report at the same level and possibly improve your accuracy over time. If you report walk too fast, more than 1.5 miles an hour, then as the stress overloads you, then your performance decreases. So a little bit of stress is good for your performance, a lot of stress is not. And finally, willpower. I didn't realise willpower was really a thing, but it is a thing that psychologists have written whole books about. And in other language, you might call it self-discipline or a bit of backbone or moral fibre, the Victorians might have described it as. But they have done some really interesting research where they take a group of volunteers and they ask them to change one aspect of their life. And then they do a set of psychological tests that test their ability to concentrate, their willpower. And if you take a volunteer and we say, all we want you to do is every time you sit down is to sit down with a straight back the way your mother taught you and do nothing else, at the end of 2 weeks, their ability to concentrate will increase. Their willpower increases. But what's even more interesting is it doesn't matter what you do. If you have increased your self-discipline in your posture, your exercise, your diet, or control of your monies, all of those increase your willpower. And if you just concentrate on one of those, all the other aspects of your life improve anyway. So the Victorians were right. This is an important bit of bringing up a child, making them sit straight and beating into them some moral fibre and backbone. So we're coming to the end of my talk now, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about the future, about how radiologists report and how they perform. And for as long as I've been a radiologist, we've been threatened with computers taking over our jobs. These are two examples of commentaries from the last year from the media. On the left, we have an article from Wired, which was just a few days ago. Robot radiologists will soon analyse your x-rays. The first line of the commentary is Google is getting really, really good at recognising photos and videos of cats. And that's their basis for why they're going to take over our jobs. Robot doctors, online lawyers, automated architects, all of these are going to replace the real thing. Is that true? Well, I don't think so, at least not yet. I can't see that far into the future. But I'm going to explain to you why I think, certainly in my career, I'm not going to be replaced by a computer. I'm going to show you a picture of a CT colonogram. It's CT colonography. So this is a test where it's not a very pleasant test. We use it as a screening test to look for polyps. So these are little bits of soft tissue that grow out of the wall of the colon. There's one. And they're supposed to be precancerous. So if you can pick them up early, you can take them out and stop people getting colon cancer. And what you do is you give patients a powerful laxative that cleans them out, and then you give them a dye which coats their bowel, and then you stick a tube up their bottom and you inflate them like a balloon, and then you do a CT scan. And what you get is a picture like this. Well, actually, that's, that, and it's that sort of sickly, pinky colour. That's not real. That's just a computer. I mean, this really is just black and white. And in fact, all the shades of grey, they're not real. This is truly black and white. 0 is air in the lumen of the gut, and number 1 is just the surface of the bowel. This is the simplest colour coding you could get on an image for a computer to analyse. And then you can apply a computer algorithm, computer-aided diagnosis. And you can set the thresholds so that CAD, computer-aided diagnosis, will pick up every single one of these polyps, all of them. But if you do that, it will call all of these normal haustral structures abnormal as well. So every patient who has no polyps will be called abnormal. Radiologists, on the other hand, may have a sensitivity of 70%. They may pick up only 70% of the polyps that are on a CT colonography study. Now, that depends on how good you are, but what they won't tend to do is overcall all these normal structures. So you've got a trade-off between how many you pick up and how many you overcall. But if you combine the two, then you can get reasonable sensitivities and specificities. We pick up most of the polyps and we don't overcall too many. If you overcall someone, that's a big deal. They have to go and then have another invasive procedure. So this is a part of radiology, a part of medicine that's incredibly focused. We're not talking about cancers here. We're talking about little polyps on very simple geometrical imaging studies with no shades or grey, just black or white, and computers have made a 10% increase in our performance. That's all. This has got nothing to do with the really complex chest x-rays that I showed you earlier. Let's look at detail, at Google's really, really good skills at looking for cats. Well, this is the paper that comes from the Google Research Lab, which is freely available. And what they did is they took 16,000 processors. So they built a supercomputer with 1 billion connections between the processors. And they fed it huge number of pictures from the internet of humans and cats and applied a machine learning program and said, go away and learn how to, I don't know how they do this, but they're computer scientists. They said, you learn how to recognize humans and cats. And to its credit, the supercomputer taught itself to recognize cats and humans with a 15.8% accuracy. Now that's the sort of thing that a toddler does every day with 100% accuracy in all light conditions at the blink of an eye. And so really, these enormous computers, which are at least 1 million times, or 1 million times smaller than the human neural network, are nowhere near the processing power of a human brain. Now I'm going to get slightly philosophical here, because I have a colleague who's an orthopedic surgeon, Simon Donnell, professor of orthopedics, who often teases me and says, Andoni, the problem with x-rays is that they are mere shadows of reality. And what he's talking about is his classical education, and he's talking about the allegory of Plato's cave. And as Socrates tells the story, in Plato's cave there is a group of human beings who have grown up there, chained to the cave, only able to look at the back wall. And the only thing they see are reflections of things that walk past. So they interpret a camel walking past as 2 separate animals, walking hand in hand, or something like that. And the point they're making is that as humans, we interpret the world around us through very strong filters. We can only interpret it in a way that our brain allows us to interpret it. But more than that, there are cultural influences. For instance, you'd have thought something like colour would be pretty fundamental. But in African countries, there are certain bush tribes who have no recognition of the colour blue. There is no word for it. They don't recognize it as a separate colour. And when you show them the colour blue, they call it a shade of green. So cultural influences can have a huge input into the way that you perceive and filter the data around you. Now I'm going to bring that allegory up to the 21st century. And here is our 21st century radiologist. She hasn't got a real chain, but she's chained by her mortgage and her private school fees to her desk where she has to earn her money. And that's the back of the cave where she spends her day reporting images. Now, all I've talked about today is one tiny part of the process, the transfer of a single bit of data from a screen to her brain and the decision she makes about whether it's normal or abnormal. That's part of the process of perception, but that's not the performance of a radiologist. A radiologist serves a population. The population I serve in Norfolk is very different from the population that will be served in London. I expect to see a completely different set of diseases. My expectations are different. Each patient that gets onto a scanner is going to be different. Some are going to be thin, some are going to be fat, some of them are going to be scared, and they're going to move, and the images are going to be terrible. And each scanner is different, made by a different company with a different version of software that processes the data in a different way. And each year we see the quality, subtle qualities of the image changing as technology advances. We have another group of clients who are the people who refer to us. These are clinicians with clinical questions. They don't know what the problems are. They're asking us for help. Now they might be a subspecialty orthopedic surgeon, a GP, a physiotherapist. They all have different levels of expertise, different knowledge. They understand a different language, and they communicate with us in completely different ways. And all of those things are still just one fragment of the complex filters by which a radiologist will look after patients. When we see a patient in an ultrasound room, I'll have one eye on the patient, one eye on the screen, one eye on my assistant who'll warn me my patient's about to faint when I stick a needle into her. And all of these things are being processed and providing positive feedback loops. So why are we only looking at one small little bit of radiologist performance? Well, Karl Popper said that science is the art of systematic oversimplification. And what he meant was, when you look at all that, you can't possibly measure that performance. We have no tools for that. So what we do is we look at the tools that we have. Well, we've got rulers, and we've got eye tracking equipment, and we've got stopwatches. So we measure things that we can measure. It's like measuring the position of a school at a league table, in a league table, and saying that's where I want my child to go. It's like measuring the function of an A&E department in their waiting times. Actually, what you want to know is, am I going to be treated properly when I have a heart attack? You don't really care how long someone with an ingrowing toenail waits in A&E. We measure things because they're measurable, not because they are a measure of the function of, in this case, a radiologist. But I would argue that there is a tool that will do all that will take that large mass of information, and it will synthesize all those shades of grey into a gestalt, an impression, and it will tell you about a radiologist's performance. If you really want to know about a radiologist in my department and whether they're any good, you should come and ask me. And you ask me this question: would I have my X-ray reported by them? And if it's in As's case, I say absolutely yes. And I would argue that's the gestalt and the measure of performance of that radiologist. Thank you.